I used to love Christmas. The lights, the warm scent of cinnamon and pine, the cozy family gatherings. It was my favorite time of year. But now, I can't see Christmas the same way. Last year, something happened that changed it forever. And even now, I still don't know how to make sense of it. It started on Christmas Eve. My parents were hosting a small gathering at our house. Just family and a couple of close friends. The snow had been falling heavily all day, the kind that blanketed everything in an eerie, muffled silence. By 10 p.m., the guests were gone, and it was just me, my parents, and my younger brother, Ethan. After everyone left, we gathered in the living room. The tree was lit up with soft, multicolored lights, the fire crackling in the hearth. Ethan was on the floor, trying to shake the presents under the tree to guess what they were, while Mom and Dad shared a glass of wine on the couch. I was on my phone, scrolling aimlessly, when my mom suggested we all head to bed early. "You don't want to scare Santa away," she joked, mostly for Ethan's benefit. I laughed, but Ethan rolled his eyes. At 13, he was just old enough to be skeptical, but not quite ready to give up on the magic completely. By midnight, I was in bed, tucked under the covers in my childhood room. It always felt strange coming back home after moving out, like stepping into a time capsule. My room was exactly how I'd left it, with the same posters on the walls and the same creaky bed frame. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, a faint crunching sound outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the snow shifting, or maybe an animal. We lived in a quiet, wooded area, and it wasn't unusual to hear raccoons or deer at night. But as I listened closer, the sound didn't seem random. It was deliberate, like footsteps. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed and pulled the curtain aside, peering out into the snowy darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. The yard was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the porch light. But just as I was about to turn away, something caught my eye. A man was standing at the edge of the yard, near the tree line. He was tall, wearing a long dark coat and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. My breath caught in my throat. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor, but something about him didn't sit right. He didn't belong. There was no reason for anyone to be out there at this hour, especially not in a snowstorm. I ducked back from the window, my heart pounding. I considered waking my parents, but what would I even say? That a man was standing outside? Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he'd just gotten lost or was cutting through the yard to avoid the road. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to bed, but couldn't sleep. I kept straining my ears, listening for any sound, but after a while, the footsteps stopped and the house fell silent again. The next morning, Christmas Day, I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Ethan was the first one up, as always, and I followed him downstairs to the living room. The tree looked beautiful in the morning light, and for a moment, I let myself relax. But then Ethan opened the front door to look at the snow, and his voice broke through the quiet. "Hey, come look at this." We all rushed to the door. There, in the snow leading up to the house, were footprints. They were human footprints, clearly defined in the fresh snow. They started at the edge of the yard and went all the way up to the porch. My dad frowned. Probably one of the neighbors, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Something about the tracks unsettled me. The strides were long and precise, almost too perfect, like whoever made them had been walking with a purpose. And the oddest part? There were no tracks leading away from the house, only to it. Ethan was about to step outside when my mom stopped him. "Let's not track snow into the house," she said, ushering him back inside. We tried to brush it off, but it lingered in the back of my mind all day. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that man again. The rest of the day was uneventful. We opened presents, ate dinner, and played board games by the fire. By the time night fell, I was starting to convince myself it had all been a coincidence. But then, just as we were getting ready for bed, it happened again. Ethan was the one who saw it first. He'd gone to the living room to grab his phone and came running back, his face pale. "There's someone outside," he whispered. We all followed him to the window. The man was back. He was standing closer this time, halfway across the yard. His coat and hat were dusted with snow, and even though his face was partially hidden, I could feel his eyes on us. My dad grabbed a flashlight and stormed out onto the porch, shouting, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, silent and still. "Do you need help? Are you lost?" my dad called out. No response. My dad took a step off the porch, shining the flashlight toward the man. But as the beam hit him, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. We spent the next hour searching the yard and the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of him. The only thing we found was a small box wrapped in plain brown paper, sitting on the porch. Inside was a single piece of paper. Written in neat, precise handwriting were 3 words: I see you. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we packed our bags and left. It's been a year now, and I still don't have answers. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but every time I hear the crunch of snow underfoot, I feel that same cold dread creep over me, and I can't help but wonder, what if he comes back? Growing up, Christmas was always magical at my Aunt Linda's house. She had this knack for turning her already cozy home into a winter wonderland. Every room glowed with twinkling lights, garlands hung from every banister, and a giant fir tree stood in the living room, decorated with hundreds of ornaments. She claimed she'd been collecting them since she was a child, each one with its own story. It was tradition for the family to gather at her place on Christmas Eve, and I always looked forward to it. Until last year. Last Christmas changed everything. I arrived late that evening because of work. I worked at a hospital at the time, so we were quite busy, surprisingly. By the time I got there, the party was in full swing. My cousins were laughing by the fire. My uncle was refilling everyone's drinks, and Christmas music played softly in the background. It was warm and cheerful, just as it always was. The first thing I noticed, though, was the tree. It was massive this year, even bigger than usual, its branches heavy with ornaments. There were the usual ones I recognized, the glass angels, the handmade stars, the little wooden sleighs. But near the bottom of the tree, just above the base, there was one I'd never seen before. It was a small, hand-painted bauble, cream-colored with faded red swirls and intricate gold accents. But it wasn't the design that caught my attention. It was the face. Painted on the front of the bauble was a smiling face. But there was something off about it. The smile was too wide, and the eyes were uneven, almost human in their intensity. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I brushed it off. Aunt Linda had dozens of ornaments after all. Maybe I just hadn't noticed this one before. Pretty, isn't it? Aunt Linda said, coming up behind me. I jumped a little and laughed. Yeah, it's unique. Is it new? Her expression shifted, just for a moment, her usual warmth replaced by something unreadable. It's an old one, very old. Before I could ask more, she changed the subject, offering me a drink and pulling me toward the rest of the family. The night carried on as usual, food, drinks, and plenty of laughter. But I couldn't stop glancing at that ornament. No matter where I was in the room, it seemed like the painted face was watching me, its crooked smile almost taunting. As the evening wound down, people started to leave. My parents and cousins said their goodbyes, but I planned to stay overnight in the guest room. as I often did, as the drive home was a lot longer than the rest of the family. By midnight, it was just me and Aunt Linda left. "Did you enjoy yourself?" she asked as she tidied up the kitchen. "Of course," I said, though I couldn't shake the weird feeling that had been nagging at me all night. "You know," she said after a moment, "there's something special about that ornament you were looking at." I froze. "It belonged to my grandmother," she continued, her tone casual. "She gave it to me when I was little and told me it would keep me safe. She said it was protective." Her words didn't match the look in her eyes. There was something dark there, something that made my skin crawl. I forced a smile and mumbled something about being tired, excusing myself to the guest room. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke to a strange sound, like a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was a branch against the window, but as I lay there, I realized it was coming from inside the house. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it was getting closer. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound stopped just outside my door. My heart was racing as I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find the house quiet. Aunt Linda was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she made coffee. "Sleep well?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "Yeah," I lied. As I grabbed a mug and poured myself some coffee, something caught my eye. The tree was still lit, the ornaments glinting in the morning light. But the strange bauble, the one with the painted face, was gone. "Hey, where's that ornament?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She looked up, confused. "Which one?" "The one with the face, the one you said was your grandmother's." Her expression went blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." I stared at her, trying to read her face. Was she messing with me? "It was right there," I said, pointing to the spot where I'd seen it the night before. She shook her head, turning back to her coffee. "You must have imagined it." A week later, my cousin called, her voice shaking. "No one's seen Aunt Linda," she said. "The police searched the house, but there was no sign of her. The only thing out of place was the tree. It had been tipped over, ornaments scattered everywhere." "What about the ornament?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "That's the weird part," she said. "They hadn't found anything like it. They said it was like it wasn't there to begin with. The police had suspected she ran away. There were some missing clothes and a suitcase missing. She'd been divorced for a while, so the family had rumors she'd found a guy someplace else and packed up and left. I don't believe that was the case. I can't help but think there was something up with that ornament." I've always loved Christmas. It's my favorite time of the year. Hot cocoa by the fire, the glow of Christmas lights, and the cozy gatherings with family. But after what happened last year, the season has never felt the same. It was a particularly harsh winter. Snowstorms had blanketed the streets in thick layers of white, and the air was bitterly cold. My mom and I lived in a small, two-story house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, with my dad gone for the holidays visiting his family overseas. It was just the two of us. To make things festive, Mom decided to throw a Christmas Eve party for the neighbors. The night of the party, the house was filled with laughter and music. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles and cookies, and kids ran around in Santa hats. It was perfect. Or so I thought. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. My mom and I exchanged confused looks. Everyone we'd invited was already here. "I'll get it," I said. Weaving through the crowd, I opened the door to find a man dressed as Santa Claus. He stood motionless on our snowy porch, his red suit dusty and tattered, his white beard slightly yellowed. He was holding a large burlap sack. "Ho, ho, ho," he bellowed in a voice that was too loud and raspy, like he was forcing it. "Merry Christmas." "Hi," I said hesitantly. "Can I help you?" "Santa heard there's a party here," he said, grinning widely. His teeth were yellow and uneven, and there was something unsettling about his eyes. They didn't twinkle like you'd expect from Santa. Instead, they were glassy and cold, like he was looking through me rather than at me. Before I could respond, my mom appeared behind me. "Oh, Santa," she exclaimed, clearly charmed. "Come on in. The kids will love this." I wanted to say no, to shut the door in his face, but it felt rude to stop her. So I stepped aside as she welcomed him in. The man ducked under the doorway, his sack slung over his shoulder. As he walked into the living room, the kids erupted in cheers. They ran over to him, shouting their wish lists and tugging at his suit. He laughed and patted their heads, reaching into his sack to pull out small, cheap toys wrapped in plain brown paper. But as the night went on, something about him felt off. He didn't join in on the Christmas carols or make small talk with the adults. Instead, he stood in the corner, watching everyone, especially the kids. His grin never wavered, and his glassy eyes followed every movement in the room. At one point, I noticed him staring at a little girl named Sophie, who couldn't have been older than 6. She was sitting by the tree, playing with one of the toys he'd given her. His gaze was so intense that it made my stomach churn. I pulled my mom aside. "Do you know him?" I whispered. She shook her head. "I thought he was one of the neighbors." "He's not," I said firmly. "I've never seen him before." My mom frowned, glancing over at him. For the first time, she looked unsure. "Maybe I should ask him to leave," she said. But before she could, the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into darkness, and a collective gasp filled the room. "It's probably the storm," Mom said, trying to stay calm. "I'll check the breaker box." She grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement. The guests murmured nervously, some pulling out their phones for light. I turned to look for the Santa, but he was gone. "Did anyone see where he went?" I asked, my voice trembling. The adults shook their heads. Panic bubbled in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started searching the house, my heart pounding in my ears. The living room was empty. The kitchen was too. Then I heard it, a faint thudding sound coming from upstairs. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But something compelled me to move forward. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my trembling hand. The thudding grew louder as I reached the second floor. It was coming from the hallway closet. I stopped in front of the door, my breath hitching. "Mom?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I reached for the doorknob and yanked the door open. Empty. I exhaled shakily, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. But then, I noticed something, a single wet footprint on the floor, leading down the hallway. It was large, too large to belong to anyone at the party. I followed the footprint, my heart racing. It led to my bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open, and my flashlight landed on the Santa. He was standing in the middle of my room, his sack open on the floor. Inside were ropes, duct tape, and a large hunting knife. He turned to face me, his grin wider than ever. "Santa's got a special gift for you," he rasped, taking a step toward me. I screamed and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. The guests were already panicking, trying to find candles and flashlights in the dark. "He's upstairs," I yelled. "Call the police." A few people ran outside to get a signal, while others tried to calm the crying kids. My mom came rushing up from the basement, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked. Before I could answer, heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. The Santa appeared at the top, the knife gleaming in his hand. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed and scrambled for the door. My mom grabbed me and pulled me outside into the snow. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched the house, he was gone. All they found was the sack, abandoned in my room. Over the next few weeks, the police investigated, but they never found the man. None of the neighbors recognized him, and his description didn't match any known suspects. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but every Christmas Eve, I lock my doors and check my windows, wondering if he'll come back.